Welcome back to How to Cake It. This week I want to talk about how to bring fruits to life. As you know, I'm a big fan of fruits and caking fruits. And so I want to go over some of the key elements that will really help you in your cake decorating. I also think they're great because you can easily impart the flavors of a fruit into your cake as well. Sorry, vegetables, that's not true of you. So first up to bat is giant strawberry cake. This was a highly requested cake. Actually, it wasn't until I said to myself on the channel that I should cake strawberry, and then it became highly requested. And when people think of strawberries, what do we think of? A nice, ripe, juicy red strawberry. We definitely think of the seeds, which I learned are ovaries. And then we think of like its crowning glory. I actually like the crown. I think it's like a perfect handle. I don't remember if I did a strawberry simple syrup, but you can definitely do a strawberry simple syrup, and you can definitely make a strawberry buttercream by pureeing strawberries, straining it, and using the really thick puree to flavor your buttercream. And then you can further enhance it with food coloring because it won't be as red or as pink as you want it to be. After you shape your strawberry, the next most important thing, obviously, is the color of the fondant. I get upset when I buy strawberries and they're still white. You know what I'm saying? You know when they haven't like ripened, and I get so annoyed. It's not the strawberry's fault, it's the strawberry picker's fault, okay? So, number one, have a model. If you're trying to mimic something, you always want to have a model, so go out and find perfect strawberries and have them beside you when you're coloring fondant. Number two, always keep in mind that food coloring is very literal, meaning, you know, when you use red, it's like red, right? Whereas colors in nature are very nuanced. So get a bunch of different reds. Have food coloring that can change the tone of the red, like ivory, which will warm it up, or like green, which will help it become dull, since it's the opposite of red on the color wheel. And then also I would say use the color in two ways. So with the strawberry, not only did I color the fondant, but after the fact I painted the fondant, because fondant is very matte. It looks like Play-Doh, and that's not what a strawberry looks like. So even though I'm covering the strawberry in colored fondant, you also want to paint that fondant. When I used to make cakes in my mother's kitchen, it was yellow and it was very sunny, which is beautiful if you're making your morning coffee and you're having dinner, but when you're coloring fondant, that hue projects onto everything. So I remember I'd have a really hard time. The light surrounding the room would trick my eye. So when I built my kitchen in the basement, it was entirely white. This cake is a bit tricky because not only do I have to paint it, but I have to add all those seeds or ovaries. So the most tedious part is making all of the seeds. And truthfully, like if I was making a wedding cake and I had decorations to add, I would make them all ahead of time. With novelty cakes, what's hard is I could have made all the seeds ahead of time. And then by the time I shaped my cake, iced it, covered it, realized they're too big or too small. And now I have to do it again. So with novelty, I tend to like to wait till that stage.
So you can't just buy strawberry seeds?
No, you wouldn't believe it. You can't buy giant strawberry seeds anywhere. And you know what? I contemplated using pine nuts because they're very similar in shape, but they honestly, when I stared at the strawberries, they aren't yellow enough. To make the crown, I used green gum paste. And once again, same like the seeds. If I made this ahead of time, I wouldn't know if it was the right. And so having the cake in front of me, I was able to make a template. So I basically made a paper template that looked like a big flower. So I used that template to cut out my gum paste once it's rolled out, painted the surface, painted underneath a bit. So with the body of the strawberries are shiny, or they have moisture. So I choose to use wet paint. So I dilute gel color in food coloring and paint. If I wanted the item to be shiny, like let's say it was something artificial or plastic that's really shiny and colored, I would add piping gel to that same mixture, and that would ensure that the sheen stayed the way it is even when the paint dries. And then color dust is when the item is matte. So even though the strawberry has a lot of moisture, its leaves don't read the same. Right? Like they read more. They're not dried, but they're definitely more matte. And they also have a bit of texture. And so by dry brushing, you get all of the above. And then, of course, I made a stem. I love when I buy strawberries and I get one with a stem. I don't know why. I don't know why it makes me feel special. The next cake I want to talk about is the most obvious, and of course he petitioned his way into this video. He thinks he's the #1 fruit. So it is Walter, the watermelon cake. This was a cake I daydreamed about before the channel, and when we first started the channel, I really wanted to make it. I love it because it's decorated inside and out. So the inside is pink velvet cake. I dyed the buttercream the same color, and then there's chocolate chips for the seeds. I think that's why this cake is so stunning. Like, it's not the hardest cake on the channel at all. With Walter, the most important part is the painting. Definitely in this case, think you need a model. So pick up a watermelon, make your cake, shape it, cover it in white fondant. The other thing is, this is one of the only cakes, I'm pretty sure I'm right, where the fondant is intentionally thicker. Here it's thicker because when you cut into a watermelon, you see that white rind. And so I feel like there's comments on this that are like, the fondant is thick, but it has to be. It would not look like a watermelon if I cut it and there was nothing between. Have you ever had pickled watermelon rind? Once again, just like strawberry, you want to have a bunch of different greens. You want to have some ivory to warm it up. You want to have some, in this case, it's the opposite, some red to dull it down because they're opposite colors. And take your time and build the color. Strawberry, it was just one coating of red. This is about layering and building because a watermelon almost looks striped. So you're not gonna do that in one shot. We're gonna paint the base color of the watermelon first and let it dry. Watermelon is a combination of a lighter green and a darker green. So we start with the lighter shade of green first. We go back with the darker shade. I like to work on sort of the stripes first, but they're not literal stripes, right? They're imperfect, naturally occurring stripes. Paint the stripe on and let gravity pull the stripe down the cake, and then work out each stripe by stippling. Because if all you do is make brush strokes, that's not gonna look like a watermelon. And then of course a nub. Strawberry has a crown, a watermelon has a nub, but always remember to add that part to make it look more realistic. I was nice to Walter, okay? Because every watermelon I've ever bought has like a yellow flat spot at some point. Because where it sits on the ground, I didn't. I made him perfect. He's an immaculate watermelon. Dragon fruit. This was on my bucket list for a long time, but this, like turkey, was a cake. And I'm talking like it was one. It was 2 dragon fruits. This was a cake that while I was making it, I was thinking, why did I want to make this? So for this cake, there's other fruit cakes where matching the color of the fruit is very important. This is always true. In this case, I had to figure out what the seeds could be. Chocolate chips won't work, they're too big. I went to my local bulk store and they had black sesame seeds. So even though I know that the seeds in the dragon fruit are quite round, I knew that it wouldn't really read and it would just look seedy, which is what I was going for. That was hurdle number 1. The shape is relatively simple because the main part of the dragon fruit is like a rounder ball where all the, when you cut it open, you can actually physically see. So I wanted the cake to also mimic that. Next up was dyeing the fondant to match a dragon fruit skin, which again is part of making any fruit cake, because in this case, it's more like strawberry. I need the base color and I'll add paint later. It's not like watermelon where the skin entirely comes from painting. Then I had to cover each one of my cakes that were now formed like a ball filled with buttercream to match the cake. And the good thing about this is normally it's hard to get a sphere covered perfectly smooth because no matter what, a lot of excess fondant is gonna gather down around the bottom and it takes time to work it out. But dragon fruits are quite, I don't wanna say wrinkly, but there's texture in the skin and it kind of overlaps. It almost looks like it's been folded. So that made my job covering it easier. Now here's where it got tricky and here's where I started to regret my choice. The skin seems to have, I won't even call them leaves. What are they called? Horns? I have no idea. Maybe they are horns. They're dragons. When I'm making a cake like this, I start to feel defeated. So I just had to do it step by step by step. I couldn't really calculate in my head how it was gonna work out. So again, this is why it's so important to have a model. And I would just roll more of the fuchsia colored fondant, create the strips. As it gets down to the bottom of the dragon fruit, those strips get thicker and kind of stick out. So I used a hexagon cutter to mimic the natural pattern. And I just kept adding to the dragon fruit until it looked the way I wanted it to look. it's time to add the green parts to the dragon fruit, the tips and the parts that extend out of the opening. I dyed some gum paste, a nice light green, cut out petals, and to cut out all the little horns. And what's interesting is the horns kind of like protrude. That's a word. Like they stick right out. So I ended up making slits in the cake and putting folded paper in the slit, because as soon as fondant is exposed to air, it begins to dry on the surface. So what I was afraid of is letting that fondant dry and later on making slits, and then that would cause cracks and wrinkles and elephant skin in the fondant. But before I added the green parts, I did something on a fruit that I haven't had to do with any other fruit. Seam hiding. You take some of the same fondant you used to cover the cake, and then you thin it out with a spatula and clear food grade alcohol. And what you basically do is just pour enough alcohol on and painted it into the gaps and grooves where the fondant meets each other. Because even though there is that pattern, there's no actual gap or seam. That's just the way it grows. I again paint the whole surface of this just to give it a little bit of a sheen, and then I have to paint all the green leaves because again, it has a base color, just like strawberry. I'm painting the leaves with dry dust, and the leaves actually get a bit pink in the middle. So again, the model really helps so you can get all those extra details and make it look real. And then what I really loved about the dragon fruit, I've made a lot of nubs, but this nub is pretty special. It looks almost floral. It had a definite pattern. I feel like I nailed the color of the inner flesh. I nailed the color of the outside and the leaf. But I knew that when I cut the cake, as satisfying as it was gonna be, it wasn't going to be wet enough on the surface because the dragon fruit on the inside is like a watermelon, like it's very wet. So I took a moment before we shot the final pictures to ice a thin layer of clear piping gel on the surface of the cut one. So I hope these tips on bringing fruits to life have really helped you. You know, be open-minded, play around with food coloring, piping gel, color dust, even fondant paste when it's necessary. Leave a comment below, let me know which one of these fruits is your favorite. And leave me a comment what the next fruit I cake should be. I will see you next week.